All right, welcome back. Today I just wanted to tell you that ayahuasca is bad news. Ayahuasca is bad news. And why do I say this? And this is just a part of my Holistic Insight series, 4th video out of 5. And what I'm really trying to say is that ayahuasca is bad news for the ego. Ayahuasca is bad news for the love of poison. That's what it has been like for me. Ayahuasca has bad news for my love for toxicity, my love for poison, the things that I just used to escape. Ayahuasca was bad news for that identity that was wrapped up in numbing, in escaping, in running away from the pain. And really, it's a good day for the soul when the ego is having a bad day. What's that quote? That quote by Mike Robbins. Bad day for the ego is a good day for the soul. And my experience with ayahuasca has been exactly that. So I wanted to talk about time and intolerance first. It didn't happen overnight. My time with ayahuasca, the more time I spent with her, the more I became intolerant to processed foods, processed sugars, even substances, substance abuse, drugs, weed, alcohol. So much so, I never thought I would quit weed. Honestly, I thought I was gonna smoke weed for the rest of my life, and I had no problem with that. And when I started working with ayahuasca, as years went by, I want to say after about a year and a half into it, I was really not enjoying being high on weed. I really didn't enjoy it. And the more time I spent working with ayahuasca, the more my body became just way sensitive to stimulants in general, to where I even cut out coffee. It just became so intolerant and sensitive to stimulants that I felt better at baseline, at being sober. Being sober felt so much better the more I started to work with ayahuasca. The more I started to work with ayahuasca, if I would smoke weed, the more I disliked that feeling. It's just I remember I'd get high and I'd be like, oh gosh, I just want to be sober already. Why did I smoke that? And it just became more and more unpleasant. And so it was bad news for those addictions. It was bad news for that life that I was living for so long. It was bad news for that identity. I thought I would just be a weed smoker for the rest of my life. So that has been the case. A lot of the candies and junk foods. I used to be able to eat Snickers bars and Twix and just candy, cookies. It just made me even more intolerant of that. I want to say though, it actually amplified an intolerance that already began in 2013. So I don't know if I had mentioned this in any of my videos before, but I got into an accident riding supermoto. I used to ride supermoto, was getting really into stunting, and we used to run from the cops, and that was my idea of fun. And during that time, I think it was the peak of my addiction as well. I was always high. I was never sober. I was always high on weed, at least. Weed, edibles, and then just stunting, motorcycle, just the adrenaline. But I eventually got into an accident running from the cops, and that's a whole nother story. Maybe I'll go into it in another video. But I ended up getting blunt force trauma to the abdomen. I had to get surgery on my abdomen. I ended up getting my appendix removed. And when my appendix was removed, I ended up having to take these 2 antibiotics prescribed by the doctors at that time. This was around 2013. And it was ciprofloxacin and metronidazole. And up until that point, I always just did what the doctors said. I always had trust in what the doctors recommended all the way up until that point. I want to say 5 days into taking this ciprofloxacin and metronidazole, which was supposed to clear up any kind of infection in my abdomen, infection in my stomach after they removed the appendix. It was supposed to clean up an infection, right? As antibiotics do. But what had happened was I ended up experiencing a whole lot of extra bullshit. 5 days in, I started getting like, my hands would lock up. I remember my hands would lock up. I started having like really shortness of breath, asthma attacks. And what I realized was like panic attacks, anxiety attacks. I never had any of that before, like ever in my life. I never had anxiety attacks. And I even started having like vertigo. So the vertigo lasted for a year. The panic attacks, they lasted for a very long time. I want to say, I don't know, years. But I had to work through it. I learned a whole lot of things working through this. But I also endured ruptured tendons. So I would have ruptured tendons in my back just from like moving, simple movements. I remember just like getting out of the chair, bending over to tie my shoe. I'd like pull some kind of tendon, some kind of tendon tear in my back. And that took long to heal. It took a long time to heal. Those took like years to heal. And that was a big part of what made me really partially disabled for a very long time, which kind of like ended up being the cause, or at least a major factor in why I spiraled downward so hard after that. And where I went even deeper into my addictions, deeper into escaping, deeper into numbing. And I remember I wanted to take my life. I wanted to commit suicide. I hated everything about life. But during that time, that was a dark night of the soul. Some of you may know what a dark night of the soul, aka rock bottom. And this dark night of the soul had made my body so sensitive. So another thing that happened was I ended up getting fibromyalgia. I didn't know what fibromyalgia was. I went down the rabbit hole. I tried different diets. That was when I first tried going vegan and vegetarian. I wanted to see if that would help with the inflammation. It helped with like clarity of mind for a bit, but it actually, that diet didn't have any positive effects on the inflammation and the fibromyalgia. I later found out, which is a whole nother story, and I'll go into that another time, but I later found out a year and a half later that it was fibromyalgia. And that was from trial and error, from doing testing and from doing my own research, from going down the rabbit hole, and from finally rejecting what the doctors told me. The doctors told me that was how life was going to be, that I was going to be partially disabled for the rest of my life, that it was just wear and tear, and that's just how life was going to be, which was a big part in me losing hope and wanting to commit suicide, wanting to end my life. It was like, what was the point of living? You know? But that time, it tremendously made me intolerant of a lot of foods, from gluten, flour, and that was the main one, gluten, flour. And I realized that before that, I used to eat all kinds of gluten snacks, cookies, cakes. I used to bake all my edibles, pizzas, toast. So that already had made me really sensitive. Just like my whole nervous system felt fried. My nervous system felt like so sensitive to every little thing, which would cause a panic attacks, would make me feel unsafe, which would just, it was a whole mess. It was a bad dream. It was hell. And after climbing out of that, it took years to climb out of that somewhat. The journey had continued even till this day to really reverse all that, which led me to going to ayahuasca. But after doing ayahuasca, I felt like that made my nervous system and my body so incredibly sensitive to every little thing, which in one way it seemed like a curse, right? And that was where I felt like ayahuasca was bad news. It felt like a curse because I could no longer enjoy certain foods. Like for a while, even after the ciprofloxacin and when I realized all of that gluten intolerance, I was able to even eat like gluten-free flours, gluten-free cookies, and I would get away with that. But I want to say the further I got into ayahuasca, just processed food in general, like no bueno. Like it's not happening with my body. My body becomes extremely angry. I get the whole relapse of fibromyalgia. It's hell, and it takes like a week to clear. So all of those comfort snacks and escape candies and foods and processed foods, that had to go. That was, I realized, one of my biggest drugs of choice. And that was a big drug for my emotional eating, my emotional snacking. But that all ended. So the more time I spent with ayahuasca, the greater my intolerance to all of these processed foods, substances, weed, alcohol became. Even alcohol, like, I think I had already quit. No, actually, I had already quit alcohol before I even started doing ayahuasca because of the gluten thing. I remember every now and then I would try like the gluten-free alcohols and some hard alcohols, but I was never a big fan of hard alcohol. So again, it was like a curse, but also a blessing. It was a curse because it felt like it was so hard to eat socially, to eat with my family. My family, we grew up eating all those things. So when I suddenly had these intolerances, it was like my family was not going to change. And that was the whole realm of me learning to like really figure out what diet would work for me. Really understand diet and its effect of inflammatory markers. So, although there's bad news, ayahuasca brings bad news, but on the other side of it is actually really good news and blessing, right? So is life. So is life in general if we really start to pay attention and gain a bird's eye view of what is really happening. If we can look through the eyes of our soul and stop viewing the eyes through our wounded ego, we will see that everything that seems like bad news is actually good news for the soul. So like Mike Robbins says, a bad day for the ego is a good day for the soul. So that was like one of the biggest things that was so hard. Again, ayahuasca did not make me so aware of the intolerance to poison relationships with people. That was something I learned through psychotherapy, through sand play therapy, and through my own exploration in the realm of psychotherapy. So, but as far as like substances, processed foods, the thing that goes into my body, that really created so much bad news, what I considered bad news back then. Nowadays, I still kind of miss eating certain junk food sometimes. I can get away with just a little bit, but very like microdosing. Like if I'm gonna eat a candy bar, like let's say an Andes chocolate, I mean I can eat a little bit of it, but it literally has to remain a microdose. If I binge at all, or even just eat what I used to eat, like a regular candy, a regular snack that's not sustainably manufactured or cooked and created by people with integrity, with companies with integrity, it affects me deeply. And I learned through the ayahuasca journey of the spirit that is behind everything, right? It's like the spirit that is behind some of these companies and their intentions, where it's more about profit over people's health. A lot of it is profit over people's health. And I notice if I get entangled with that kind of spirit, that kind of product of those companies and corporations, it really affects my health. It affects my mental, emotional, physical health. Like I feel it in my bones. I feel it in my gut. I feel it like in my body. And my body lets me know how much I just broke a rule. So that was really hard. I want to say that was one of the worst news of my life, working with ayahuasca, is that I had to give those things up. And it's been years now, so it's like I'm so accustomed to it, and I'm so used to always being looked at weird too, because like, you know, in my community, it's still so common for a lot of people to not understand what they're putting in their body, to still eat all of these processed foods, to still eat all this junk food, to still eat the rancid seed oils. And you know, I'm not shaming anybody, and I realize that I was in that place too, and that's just a part of everyone's growth in awareness, everyone's growth in consciousness. But I understand also how it is all on purpose. This is all on divine purpose, because I'm teaching this right now. Like, I'm teaching this, and this is like divinely orchestrated. So although that was bad news, it has been extremely beneficial for my soul. The more I had cleaned out my body, the more I had purged my body, cleansed my body, purified my body, my sacred temple, right? This is a sacred temple that is extremely intelligent, extremely highly advanced technology that not even human beings can mimic. I mean, we try to clone, we try to make robots, we try to make things be as fluid and effortless and miraculous as a human body, but this is like unbelievable technology that we are living in, that we are experiencing life in. So that has been a blessing, to really let my soul embody my body more and more as I continue to grow on this journey. The second thing that was like really bad news about ayahuasca, and if you're thinking about doing ayahuasca, why ayahuasca is bad news, is that there is nowhere to run and nowhere to hide from your own bullshit. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from your own demons. It's so easy for us to bullshit ourselves, to, you know, make excuses, make justifications, remain in cognitive dissonance. And I'm not even saying that ayahuasca is going to cure this. I'm just saying the probability of ayahuasca showing you shit that you've been numbing out and running away from, showing you memories that were painful that you've been trying so hard to block out, ayahuasca is highly likely gonna reveal them to you, to make you process them, to see them in a new light, to where you feel that emotion, you process that emotion, and then you can finally let that emotion go, whether it's grief, shame, guilt, anger, rage, sadness, depression. There's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide from it. And that is actually what is underneath all of these addictions. That is what we are trying to run away from, what we're trying to prove to the world that, you know, doesn't exist. We're trying so hard to prove to ourselves that it doesn't exist. We're suppressing things, we're repressing emotions, and we're running away from these painful stories of the past that said we're not good enough, that said we're not safe, that made us feel unsafe. We're trying so hard to numb that story that just replays unconsciously and subconsciously until you have the courage to face it. So with ayahuasca, which is why it's so commendable a lot of times, you know, for people to go and do ayahuasca, to work with ayahuasca, is because it's someone making the decision to finally say, okay, I'm tired of running from my demons, and I'm tired of not seeing what my demons are. I'm gonna go and face this shit head on. I'm gonna see what these demons are about. I'm gonna uncover them. I'm gonna see what it takes to heal. And this is one of the beauties about this bad news. So even though it is bad news that we're gonna have to face our shit, that we're gonna have to face our demons when we do ayahuasca, the beautiful thing is that there is a purpose for it. It's not just all bad news. On the other side of the bad news is good news for the soul. So really, what ayahuasca is doing, it's shining a light on the addiction. And the more you work with ayahuasca, the more it starts to show you more and more. So she will never show you everything all at once. She'll just show you what you are ready to see each time. And a lot of times what we're ready to see, we don't think we're ready to see. I thought I had already been aware of all of the different traumas in my life before I'd done ayahuasca, because I did like hypnotherapy before I did ayahuasca, and I was like, I already know like what, the pain is. But what I learned from working with ayahuasca is that it's not just even my lifetime. Like, I've sat with ancestors in ceremony where I got to feel their pain, where I've had an ancestor like fully take over my body and weep, just like let all of that sorrow and that pain go. And again, I can't prove whether or not it was an ancestor or whether or not it was a past version of myself from another life. But, regardless, it's actually all part of my soul. So if we were to go deep into the soul, which I don't have time here, the soul, if you take the synthesis from all the different ancient studies and even modern studies of the soul, a synthesis of the soul, you could actually say that all of our ancestors, all of our past lives, all of those experiences, all of that lineage that we are feeling, that is within our DNA, that is within our experience right here, right now, is actually part of the soul. So it shines a light on it. But this is where things get kind of sticky. And this is maybe another bad news. This is another bad news about ayahuasca, is that because it shines the light on the issue, a lot of people think that it's fixed because of that. Or they think they did ayahuasca one time and it shined the light on all of the problems already and it fixed it all and they're good to go. It actually doesn't work like that. It's like the more you work with her, the longer you work with her, the more she reveals, the more she reveals, the more she shows you about your lineage, the more she shows you about past life, the more she shows you about unresolved issues within your own DNA, within your own DNA. So the issue and the bad news is that she doesn't actually move you to liberation fully. Like, she'll light a path and show you that this is what needs to be addressed in order for you to liberate yourself. And I know a lot of people who have done ayahuasca, where once they start doing ayahuasca and things get lit up, even if you turn to Christ, and it seems like everyone's life just suddenly turns upside down. It's like everything turns upside down. And really, it's the soul orchestrating your work cut out. So I put right here, the work in between the addiction and liberation is the work. Your work is cut out for you. But now you have some kind of insight. She shows you and lights up the way and gives you insight and foresight. But the real work is going to be the decisions you make from there on. It's like, okay, now we have a new awareness of what the issue is. And the real work is, how are you going to make your choices in your day-to-day life now, knowing what she just lit up? So addiction, really, it's our lost parts of us, our wounded ego. The addiction is a symptom of our lost parts, the parts we exiled, the parts repressed, the parts that have been wounded and traumatized. In shamanism, there's something called soul loss. Soul loss, it's seen as like every trauma that we experience, a part of our soul fragments and gets lost. And it does that in order for us to not fully feel the pain. So we don't fully process the pain and the trauma, part of us actually leaves and escapes to not feel that pain. But I also feel like it's part of the divine design of our experience in order to grow and to really experience God, because that is what sets up your journey to take the hero's journey. That's what sets up the whole arena and this game for us to start moving to wholeness, to start going on our quest, our hero's journey, to really discover who we are and what it is, and what it is that we're here to do in this world. But as we do the work, we gain, more and more faculty, we gain more and more gifts and skills and abilities and the capacity to be liberated, to integrate our ego, not exile. So this is what is often misunderstood, is that from going from being wounded to being whole, I notice people get lost in this process because they're still exiling these parts. They're still judging these wounded parts of them. But really the journey is learning how to have compassion for those parts of you, learning how to love those parts of you that were traumatized, learn how to give respect, honor, and tender loving care. Tender loving care is really what these parts are looking for. And oftentimes we're seeking outside of ourselves to get someone else or something else to give us that sense of tender loving care for those parts. But the journey is learning how to give that to ourselves, learning how to take 100% responsibility, like I've said, and give it to ourselves, to learn how to reparent ourselves, to learn how to integrate this wounded part of our ego as a part of our soul. And the more we actually learn how to have compassion for ourselves, to let go of the shame, to let go of the guilt, the more we actually be whole, the more we actually get to experience our wholeness. We're not exiling a part of us. And also when we stop exiling a part of ourselves, we'll stop judging and exiling that part in other people. Well, if you actually pay attention, you'll notice that your harshest judgments towards other people or even situations and circumstances is actually a judgment that hides deep within ourselves. We have that judgment toward ourselves, toward our past, toward these wounded parts of us. And that was actually taught through us through the trauma. We're almost just replaying what we experienced in the trauma. So if someone was a perpetrator, that story plays in our head, but we become the perpetrator unconsciously and subconsciously. And we start perpetrating ourselves. We become the judge. We become the critic because we're programmed that way as children. But again, this is what sets up the hero's journey to do the work. And so although it's bad news that ayahuasca doesn't take you all the way here, it's actually a blessing. Can you imagine if your mom, she brushed your teeth, right? She brushed your teeth when you were a little child and brushed your teeth until you're old enough to hold the toothbrush. But can you imagine if she never allowed you to learn how to do that for yourself? Like, what about even dressing you? Can you imagine if you're like 40 years old and your mom is still dressing you, still brushing your teeth, still driving you everywhere? I mean, no offense if you have a disability and you can't drive anywhere, or no offense in general if you're just dealing with a phobia of driving. But still, I'm saying ayahuasca is the same thing. It's like she's going to help us on our feet, but we can't use her as crutches. And that's the main thing. And that's the bad news about ayahuasca, is a lot of people think that ayahuasca, because she helped you get up on your feet, that you need her to run, that you need her to walk, that you need her for the rest of your life. But she actually doesn't work like that. She's just going to help you on your feet and then not steal that blessing of development for you, because it is a blessing that we get to practice that and develop these characteristics, develop these skills and abilities and gifts and capacity to be who our soul authentically came to be. So that is the blessing of it. You know, ayahuasca is not going to take that away from us. There's that, what is that other quote? Ask God for strength and he gives you obstacles, right? It's like God works like a heyoka. God works in a backward way, in a backward fashion. And that's just the way ayahuasca works as well. It's like she works in a backward fashion. But it's a beautiful thing that she gives us the bad news. It's a beautiful thing that she's a bearer of bad news. And I had, man, even though I thought that I had already known about the traumas before I went into working with ayahuasca, I remember I must have been on my, I think this is like 3.5 years in. 3.5 years of working with ayahuasca. I remember being in a ceremony and I just started remembering all of this trauma I experienced in the 7th grade of being like just bullied and assaulted and tormented like for, you know, like for a couple years while I was in that school. And this was when I was a preteen and I was a late bloomer. I didn't go through puberty as early as like a lot of other people. Not to mention that that school was full of such dark energy. Like in my ceremony, I got to see the spirits that were like overtaking the school, and meth was a big part of that school. That was the first time I was ever exposed to seeing people doing meth. It was in the 7th grade. See kids smoking meth in the bathroom. But there were these flunkies in our school, and shout out to other people who know what I'm talking about. Those of you who know me, you know what I'm talking about. But they would jack everybody for their money. They would come in like mobs and groups and just like steal your money. And I remember getting like punched in the face, but I had completely blocked that out of my memory completely. And I remember when I woke up to that in ceremony, when that hit me in ceremony, at the time, well, this is still part of my spirit animal, but my spirit animal, ever since I started working with ayahuasca, is a black jaguar whose name is Koa. And I have some wild stories about this, but I remember when I had woken up to that memory in ayahuasca, I remember my face turned into a black jaguar and I started snarling. I remember snarling and I got up and I ended up walking across the field to the bathroom, and I was just like snarling and I was so angry. I felt like my face turned into like a freaking vicious black jaguar, and I was walking to the bathroom just like psycho. Like I was so mad and so furious. But looking back, I realized like I finally got to process that anger. I finally got to process that anger and have compassion and let it go. Because I understood that all of those kids were just products of their traumatic environment as well. Not to excuse their behavior, but also understanding that it played a big role in making me who I am. It actually gave me strength. It actually made me stronger. It actually made me more resilient. But during that time, it was hell. I hated it. It was like the worst experience ever, right? And that's how it is for all of our trauma. So the more we start to actually let go of the addiction and trust our soul, trust our sobriety and the authenticity of our soul, we're going to actually start to have a much higher perspective on what had happened. And hopefully sooner than later, you'll start to understand what is developing in you, what strength your soul needs to develop and express your soul genius, your soul gift into the world. But yeah, ayahuasca is bad news, and there's no running from your bullshit if you do it long enough. I mean, if you don't do it long enough, well, also, again, you can do it too long, and ayahuasca wants you to run on your own and stop using her as a crutch and do the work yourself. So, you know, there's a good happy medium where she works really well. Not too little, but not too much. And that's been my personal experience. Anyway, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.